Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, the townspeople would witness a strange yet familiar sight: a young girl, no older than 10, walking silently down the empty streets, followed closely by a pack of 6 large German shepherds. There were no leashes, no commands, yet the dogs followed her obediently, as if bound by an unspoken connection. They moved in perfect harmony, their paws making barely a sound against the cobblestone road, their eyes occasionally flickering toward the girl, waiting for some invisible signal. The townspeople watched from their windows and doorways, a mixture of curiosity and unease in their eyes. How could such a young child control such powerful animals with nothing but her presence? Some whispered that she had a gift, an ability to communicate with them in ways no one else could understand. Others speculated more outlandish theories, that she had been raised by wolves, or that she was the reincarnation of an ancient spirit who could tame even the wildest of creatures. The girl, however, remained a mystery. She never spoke a word to anyone, never strayed from her path. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as if she belonged more to the world of the dogs than to the town itself. Some mornings, she would pause at the edge of the forest, standing still as the wind rustled through the trees. The dogs would sit beside her, their ears perked, their bodies tense, as if listening to something no human could hear. Despite the town's endless speculation, no one ever dared to approach her. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was the unshakable sense that she and her dogs were part of a secret far older and deeper than any of them could comprehend. And so, the girl and her pack continued their silent walks through the town, leaving behind nothing but the whispers of those who watched, and the lingering question that no one could answer. The town had always been peaceful, a quiet place where everyone knew each other's names, where mornings began with the scent of fresh bread from the bakery and evenings ended with warm lights glowing behind lace-curtained windows. But ever since the girl arrived with her pack of dogs, an unsettling silence had settled over the community, one thick with uncertainty, curiosity, and fear. She was no older than 12, with unkempt hair that framed her pale face and eyes that held a sadness too deep for a child. She never spoke, never asked for help, never smiled. Every day, she walked through town with slow, deliberate steps, her thin frame wrapped in a worn-out coat too large for her. The dogs, 5 of them, large and wild-looking, moved with her like shadows, their sharp eyes scanning the streets, their bodies tense as if ready to protect her at any moment. At first, people whispered about her with mild curiosity. Who is she? Where did she come from? Some believed she was an orphan, abandoned and left to fend for herself. Others muttered darker theories, saying she had been cursed or that she was the ghost of a lost child who had returned with her hounds to haunt the living. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers turned into unease. The townspeople avoided her, not out of cruelty but out of fear of the unknown. Shopkeepers hesitated to call out to her, parents pulled their children closer when she passed, and the elders exchanged wary glances whenever they saw her. The town had always taken care of its own, but she felt like an outsider, someone who did not belong. Despite the silent rejection, the girl remained unfazed. She neither begged nor sought shelter. She never reacted to the frightened stares or the cautious steps people took away from her. Instead, she carried on as if she had no need for the town's acceptance, her gaze always distant, her expression unreadable. The dogs were her only companions, her only protectors. They moved as one, their movements synchronized, their presence both intimidating and mesmerizing. No one had ever seen them attack, yet the silent warning in their eyes was enough to keep even the bravest at a distance. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the streets, rattling windows and shaking loose shutters. Most people hurried home, locking their doors against the cold, but the girl remained outside. She stood in the center of the town square, her coat billowing around her frail figure, her face lifted toward the darkening sky. The dogs surrounded her in a tight circle, their bodies tense, their ears alert. A few brave souls watched from their windows, torn between concern and fear. Why didn't she seek shelter? Was she waiting for something, or someone? The storm raged on, and for a moment, it seemed as if she and her dogs were the only ones left in the world, standing defiant against the howling winds and pouring rain. Then, Without a word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night with her loyal pack trailing behind her. The next morning, the town awoke to an eerie stillness. The girl was gone. The dogs were gone. The only evidence of her existence was a few small footprints in the mud, already fading beneath the morning sun. No one spoke of her after that, as if she had been nothing more than a strange dream. But deep down, they all felt it, that lingering weight of guilt and unease. Had they failed her? Should they have done more? Or had she been something beyond their understanding, something that had never truly belonged to their world? And so, the town returned to its peaceful routine, yet a part of it remained forever changed. Because somewhere in the back of their minds, in the quiet moments before sleep, they could still see her, walking alone through the streets, her dogs beside her, carrying a silence too heavy for words. The town had always been quiet, tucked away from the chaos of the outside world. But now, it had become the center of a national storm. What had started as hushed whispers among locals had erupted into a media frenzy, with news channels broadcasting dramatic reports and journalists swarming the streets. The image of the mysterious girl, thin, silent, always surrounded by her loyal pack of dogs, had gripped the country. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had the townspeople done nothing to help her? As days passed, the weight of public scrutiny became unbearable. Strangers flooded into town, activists demanding justice, conspiracy theorists weaving elaborate tales, and concerned citizens searching for a way to help. Some locals avoided them, shutting their doors, refusing to talk. Others tried to defend themselves, insisting they had not known what to do, that the girl had never spoken a word, that the dogs had scared them away. But their explanations rang hollow. The nation wanted answers. And the government was determined to find them. Soon, investigators arrived, officials in crisp uniforms, their expressions serious, their presence intimidating. They combed through the town, knocking on doors, taking statements, piecing together fragments of the story. Officers walked the streets where the girl had once wandered, retracing her steps, searching for anything she might have left behind. Experts analyzed security footage, trying to understand the way she moved, the way the dogs reacted to her, as if she were more than just their caretaker, more like their leader. Authorities turned their focus to the townspeople. Why had no one called for help sooner? Why had they let a child live in silence and solitude? The question struck at the heart of the town's guilt. Some admitted their shame, confessing that they had been afraid of what the girl might bring, afraid of the unknown. Others remained silent, unwilling to acknowledge their own indifference. Despite their efforts, the girl was gone. Search teams scoured the forests, followed trails, questioned travelers, but she had vanished without a trace. It was as if she had never existed at all, except for the lingering presence of her story, echoing in the minds of those who had seen her. Weeks passed, and eventually, the investigation lost momentum. No missing child reports matched her. No family stepped forward to claim her. The case was quietly closed, classified as an unresolved mystery. The media moved on, the government redirected its focus, and the town was left with nothing but its own guilt. Yet, even after the reporters had packed their cameras and the officials had driven away, a deep unease remained. Those who had looked away from her, who had turned their backs when she needed them most, now lived with an unbearable silence. And on certain nights, when the wind howled through the trees, some swore they could still hear distant footsteps, soft, fleeting, accompanied by the echo of dogs howling in the darkness. For months, the town had been shrouded in a fog of fear and uncertainty. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispered in hushed tones behind closed doors, exchanged in anxious murmurs on street corners. The girl and her pack of dogs had become a mystery that haunted the town's consciousness, a riddle no one dared to answer. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why did she refuse to speak? Then, the truth came crashing down like a tidal wave, sweeping away the town's fragile sense of normalcy. The investigators, relentless in their pursuit of justice, uncovered secrets that had been buried for years, secrets too horrifying to ignore. The girl had not simply appeared one day, she had been there all along, hidden away, imprisoned in the very heart of the community. She had been robbed of her childhood, locked away from the world, left to suffer in silence while those around her chose to look the other way. As the investigation unraveled, the weight of the town's collective guilt became unbearable. There had been signs, faint cries for help, glimpses of shadows behind closed windows, uneasy looks exchanged between neighbors. But no one had acted. No one had dared to question the unspoken rules that kept the truth buried. And now, there was no escaping the consequences. The trial was set, and the entire nation turned its gaze toward the small town, hungry for answers, desperate for justice. The courthouse overflowed with reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens who had traveled miles just to witness history unfold. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled furiously, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. The accused sat rigid in their seats, their expressions ranging from defiance to dread. Some clung to their innocence, their lawyers weaving elaborate defenses to cast doubt on the girl's testimony. Others remained silent, their eyes hollow, knowing the evidence against them was too strong to refute. The prosecutor spoke with unwavering determination, painting a vivid picture of the horrors the girl had endured, years of neglect, cruelty, and isolation. The testimonies that followed were harrowing. A neighbor who had once ignored the muffled cries admitted to feeling a deep, inescapable shame. A former teacher confessed that she had noticed the girl's absence but had never dared to ask questions. A doctor revealed that medical records had been altered, hiding the signs of abuse. When the girl finally took the stand, the room fell into a deep, solemn silence. She was no longer the wild, nameless child who had roamed the streets with her dogs. She was strong now, defiant, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. She spoke of the darkness she had lived in, the chains of fear that had bound her, and the moment she had finally found the courage to break free. The defense scrambled to shift the blame, to poke holes in her story, but the truth stood firm. It was undeniable. It was inescapable. As the judge prepared to deliver the verdict, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Time slowed. The weight of justice pressed down on every soul in the room. And then, at last, the sentence was spoken. Guilty. The word echoed through the chamber, final and irreversible. Some gasped. Others wept. The accused, now convicted, were led away in shackles, their once powerful presence reduced to nothing more than hollow shells of regret and disgrace. But justice, though served, did not bring solace. The town was left to grapple with the unbearable truth that their silence had been just as damning as the crime itself. Some vowed to change, to become better, to ensure that no other child would ever suffer the same fate. Others, unwilling to face their guilt, simply wished to forget, to bury the past once more. But the past could not be buried. The scars remained. And the girl, now free, carried them as a reminder of pain, of survival, and of a truth that could never again be silenced. In the months that followed the trial, the weight of the town's collective guilt hung heavy in the air. Silence had replaced the once bustling chatter that filled the streets, and for many, the questions that lingered in their minds were too difficult to ignore. They had witnessed the truth unfold, the horrible reality of what had been done in their own community, and now they were forced to grapple with the aftermath. Among the most affected was Samuel, a man who had long held a position of respect and influence in the town. He had been someone others looked up to, a man who often spoke up in town meetings, guiding decisions, providing a sense of stability. But now, he found himself facing a truth he had ignored for far too long. His failure to act when he first heard the whispers of the girl's suffering haunted him every day. In the beginning, Samuel had convinced himself that the rumors were just that, rumors. His belief in the town's unity and the integrity of its leaders had been unshakable. But over time, as the evidence grew stronger, as the whispers turned into cries for justice, Samuel remained steadfast in his denial. He told himself that getting involved would disrupt the fragile peace, that confronting the truth would tear apart the fabric of the community. And so, he did nothing. Now, in the aftermath of the trial, the truth was undeniable. The girl had been hurt, abused, and neglected, and he had done nothing to stop it. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his chest. Samuel sat in his study late one evening, staring at the papers scattered across his desk. His hands trembled as he reached for his pen, but he could not bring himself to write anything. What was there to say? How could he make amends for his inaction? The remorse gnawed at him, a constant reminder of his failure. He had been complicit by silence, and now the town, his community, had paid the price. In the quiet of his home, Samuel could not escape the image of the girl's face, the pain and betrayal reflected in her eyes. He had once thought of himself as a man of integrity, someone who stood up for what was right, but in this moment, he was nothing more than a man racked with guilt. He closed his eyes, remembering the quiet ways in which he had distanced himself from the truth, telling himself that it wasn't his problem, that someone else would handle it. The guilt now consumed him, and it felt as though it might suffocate him. But within that suffocating guilt was something else, a spark of determination. He could not undo the past, could not take back the words he had said, the silence he had maintained. But he could change the future. Samuel knew that the only way to move forward was to face his mistake head-on. He needed to take responsibility, not just for the harm he had caused, but for the future of the town, the future of the girl. Samuel began to take action. He reached out to the girl, who was now in the early stages of her recovery. His first encounter with her was awkward, uncomfortable. He had no words that could undo what had been done, no easy fix for the pain she had endured. But he spoke from his heart, admitting his mistakes, his failure to stand up when it mattered. The girl, though still guarded, saw something in Samuel that she had not expected, genuine remorse, and an effort to make things right. It was not an immediate healing, but it was a beginning. The town, too, struggled with its collective guilt. For weeks after the trial, the people seemed to avoid one another. They spoke in hushed tones, too ashamed to even meet one another's eyes. Their community had been fractured, not just by the horrific events surrounding the girl, but by the realization that they had all been complicit in allowing it to happen. The shame was palpable, the weight of their collective inaction a burden no one could escape. But amidst the regret and shame, a new force began to stir, hope. It was fragile, barely perceptible at first, but it was there. The girl, once an outcast, was slowly starting to rebuild her life. The trauma would never leave her, but with the truth now out in the open, she had the opportunity to reclaim her life. She was not just a victim anymore, she was a survivor, and that small but powerful truth began to shine through. She began attending therapy, surrounded by people who genuinely cared for her, people who saw her as more than just a tragedy. Slowly, she started to trust again. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of her past would overwhelm her, but she was learning to find moments of peace in the chaos. It was a slow, painful process, but for the first time, she felt like there was a path forward. For the town, the process of reintegration was not a simple one. There were those who could not face the guilt, who still avoided the truth, but there were others, like Samuel, who chose to face it, to try and make amends. The path toward healing was long, but the town was beginning to rebuild, piece by piece. Over time, people started to engage in conversations about accountability and empathy. The town began to open its eyes to the impact of their actions, or lack thereof, and they vowed to do better. Samuel became an advocate for awareness, helping to raise funds for victims of abuse, making sure that the lessons learned from the tragedy were not forgotten. The girl, in her quiet strength, became a symbol of resilience. Her progress was slow, but the community began to see her not as a victim, but as a survivor who had been failed by those around her, but who had found the courage to move forward. Hope was not a perfect, shining light. It was messy, complicated, and full of setbacks. But it was hope nonetheless. And as the town began to heal, as the girl took steps toward reclaiming her life, the town realized that healing was not about erasing the past, but about acknowledging it, learning from it, and working together to make a better future. Samuel's regret would never disappear, but the hope that was now blossoming in the town gave him a glimmer of redemption. And for the girl, now slowly rebuilding her life, hope became her anchor in the storm. The past had shaped her, but it would not define her. The future was hers to claim, and with each passing day, she grew stronger. The journey of healing was not a simple one. For her, it was a difficult and often painful path, one that seemed endlessly long in its early stages. The girl, once full of dreams and hope, was now burdened by a history of betrayal, hurt, and loss that threatened to define her. Every step forward felt like an uphill battle, but deep down, she knew that the only way out of the darkness was through it. In the beginning, it felt impossible. Every corner she turned, every new day, was just another reminder of the pain she had endured. The haunting memories of those who had failed her, of her own confusion and fear, made her doubt whether true healing was possible. She couldn't escape the echo of the past that lingered with her, no matter how hard she tried to move forward. Yet, as she sat alone in her room, staring at the empty walls, something inside her stirred. A quiet, hesitant voice within her whispered, "Maybe this is the moment to begin." It was the smallest thought, but it was enough to spark a faint flicker of hope. She realized that if she didn't try to heal, if she didn't take the first step, she would remain locked in this cycle forever. The weight of her trauma had shaped her life, but it didn't have to define it. It was time to move. She knew the first step was asking for help. This was, by far, the hardest thing for her to do. She had always been independent, relying on herself in the past, but the reality of her situation now showed her that she couldn't do this alone. She sought therapy, unsure of what to expect but desperate for a way to make sense of her brokenness. The first session was the hardest, the silence thick with uncertainty. She couldn't even look at the therapist at first, afraid that speaking the words aloud would make her pain too real. But the therapist's gentle presence and understanding expressions slowly opened a door within her, and she began to speak. At first, the words came slowly. She hesitated, unsure of how much she wanted to share, unsure of how much she could trust. Every sentence felt like an excavation of old wounds, each memory coming back sharper than before. The pain was suffocating, and sometimes, she would leave the sessions in tears, exhausted and overwhelmed. But in time, it became clear that each moment of pain was a moment of healing, as if peeling back layers of grief and loss to reveal something stronger beneath. During this time, there were moments when she almost gave up. She would have days when the weight of the past felt unbearable, and the thought of moving forward seemed too much to bear. It was as if her grief would never release its grip on her, like a constant, tight pressure in her chest. Some nights, sleep would elude her, her mind racing with thoughts of what had happened, replaying every mistake, every failure, every regret. But in the quiet, in the stillness of the night, she would remind herself that healing wasn't a straight path. It would take time. Her breakthrough came when she allowed herself to be vulnerable again. It was easy to hide behind her walls, pretending that nothing had changed, that she could simply go on as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't until she allowed herself to feel again, really feel, that her true healing began. She began reaching out to those who had supported her throughout her journey, friends who had quietly stood by her when she had needed them most. She allowed herself to lean on them, and that act of trust was the first real step she took toward reclaiming her life. There was one person who was particularly pivotal in this part of her journey, Samuel. Initially, she had resented him for his role in the past, for his inability to act when it was most needed. But now, after everything, she saw him differently. Samuel was also on his own path of redemption, seeking forgiveness for the choices he had made. He had become an ally, a friend, someone who had begun to understand the magnitude of his inaction and the harm it caused. Unlike her family or some of her other acquaintances, Samuel didn't try to push her to forgive him. He didn't try to rush her healing or suggest that everything could just go back to the way it was. Instead, he stood with her, allowing her to set the pace. In those quiet moments, when she didn't have the energy to speak, Samuel would sit beside her, his presence offering more comfort than any words could. And slowly, the girl began to trust again. It didn't come all at once, it was a gradual process. Trust was fragile, and she often found herself questioning her own instincts. But with every small act of kindness from others, with every gesture of support, her belief in people began to rebuild. She learned that trust didn't mean perfection, it meant acceptance of one's flaws and imperfections, including her own. The girl, now more determined than ever, started to see herself differently. She wasn't defined by what had been done to her, by the pain she had endured. She was beginning to reclaim her identity, not as a victim, but as a survivor. Each day, as she grew stronger, she began to understand that healing was not about forgetting or erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, integrating it into her life in a way that no longer had control over her. In time, the community that had once been silent in the face of her suffering began to change. People started talking openly about the things that had happened, about the ways in which they had failed her, and how they could make amends. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was a start. The town, once a place where secrets festered and trust was broken, began to rebuild, brick by brick. The shame and guilt that had once surrounded the girl began to dissipate, and in its place was a community working toward a better future. Samuel, too, had learned valuable lessons from his own role in her story. His path to healing was long and hard, but he embraced it. He became an advocate for the changes needed in the town, using his experience to push for accountability and compassion. He wasn't seeking forgiveness for himself. Instead, he was using his actions to show the girl and the rest of the town that redemption wasn't a one-time act. It was a continuous, daily effort. The girl's healing was far from over, but each day brought a new strength, a new sense of purpose. She wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but she knew one thing: she had the power to choose her direction. The past no longer held her captive, and she had learned to live in the present with hope for the future. Healing was not a destination, it was a journey. And she was walking it, step by step, with the knowledge that she would never be the same. She would be stronger, wiser, and more capable of facing whatever challenges lay ahead. The girl who once felt broken was learning, every day, to embrace her own strength. And in the process, she was not only healing herself but helping to heal the community around her.